Preface. Cooking was my unwinding ritual during the many leisurely years I spent studying the decision sciences, first as a graduate student at the University of Michigan and then as a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell. This book originally started, and I am being completely serious here, as an idea for a cookbook. Here's the story of how it came to be a book about decision-making. My time at Cornell between 2004 and 2006 was ridiculously idyllic. For a good part of that period, I lived a rather monastic life in an isolated apartment complex near the Buttermilk Falls State Park in the hills outside Ithaca. Not quite Thoreau's Walden Pond, but close. Every evening, I'd drive back from my office on campus past several of Ithaca's famous waterfalls. Whether the day had been frustrating or rewarding, the sight of the waterfalls would always return me to equilibrium. Soon after I settled into this routine, I noticed that dinners started in this state of waterfall-induced equilibrium seemed to turn out better. And so it was that my times in the kitchen turned into episodes of idle wondering as I chopped and stirred about the role of waterfalls and other subtle ingredients in cooking. My memories of Ithaca revolve around these solitary episodes in the kitchen. I had plenty of time to ponder the broad question of how cooks make decisions in kitchens, ranging from what can I make with what's in my fridge, to is it time to flip this pancake? Out of these episodes was born an idea for a book on improvisational cooking and the rhythms and cadences of the kitchen. But as I gathered my thoughts and began making my notes, I realized that as a cook, I was at best an enthusiastic amateur. What I really wanted to do, it became clear, was write about the interplay of rhythms, emotions, and energy in decision-making that is so vividly evident in cooking. The kitchen was just a particularly rich metaphor for a broader theme. So I started assembling the ideas into a broader synthesis and began noticing and collecting questions, ideas, and examples from other domains. It seemed to me that the rich interplay of rhythms, emotions, and energy was everywhere I looked. How was I making the apparently trivial decision of when to flip a pancake against the backdrop of impatience, hunger, wrist skill, and flame control? How, by focusing on my stroke and breathing rather than my strength, was my swim coach able to lower my sprint times and the amount of energy I spent? How do musicians performing jam sessions decide what to play next? How do good managers steer a meeting? This was a complex set of questions, and I found myself groping for that key insight, that high concept which would miraculously dissolve the complexity. The answer began to emerge from the research I was involved in at the time, on command and control. My research, funded by the U.S. Air Force, concerned what are called mixed initiative command and control models, complex systems where humans, autonomous robotic combat vehicles, and software systems share decision-making authority. Somewhere in my reading, I stumbled across the idea that one must control the tempo of a military engagement. Shock and awe is an example of tempo-driven war-making. The idea, and in particular the word tempo, stuck in my mind as clever and evocative. But at the time, I didn't pay much attention. It seemed like no more than a clever motif. It would take me nearly 4 more years, including 2 immersed in the decidedly non-monastic world of business, before I recognized the idea of tempo for what it was, the high concept I was looking for, to organize my messy thoughts on decision-making that began in the kitchen. I first attempted a synthesis towards the end of my postdoctoral stint with Raf D'Andrea's group at Cornell. In 2006, I designed and taught a graduate course on the decision sciences, in collaboration with my doctoral advisor, Pierre Kabamba, who taught the course in parallel at the University of Michigan. Among the workshop exercises I devised for the course were a challenge to model call and response drumming, and at least one example involving the kitchen. It was a lot of fun. Yet, despite the fun, The course had a discursive, grab-bag feel to it. One of the smartest students in the class, and a key architect of the world-beating Cornell robotics soccer team that Raf managed at the time, commented, "I like the material, but I don't yet see the thin red line connecting all the ideas." He was right. I was missing certain powerful ideas about metaphor and narrative in human decision-making that had been evolving in the humanities since the 1970s. When I left Cornell and joined Xerox in 2006, I had an opportunity to dive into those subjects. At Xerox, I encountered the fascinating world of collective, real-time business decision-making. At the same time, I started my blog, Ribbon Farm, which allowed me to tackle the ideas from the humanities that I'd encountered, but not explored in depth during my university years. And one fine day, in the summer of 2008, I realized that Tempo was the title of a book demanding to be written. A book that would weave the tragic passion of the humanities together with the unsentimental austerity of the mathematical decision sciences to tell you the story of your life. The ideas in this book were inspired by questions from everyday life at work, home, and play. I have tried to return to those worlds and frame what I have to say as deeper insights into common sense. But this has not always been possible. Ideas from dusty academic journals and from rarefied domains of practice, such as boardrooms and the decks of aircraft carriers, are not always reducible to everyday experience. So yes, at times, you will need to stretch your mind. But you should expect and even welcome the challenge. You live in a complicated world, where you must contend with globe-spanning human decision processes that affect your life. Everything you need to know, you did not learn in kindergarten. Welcome to Tempo. Chapter 1. 1.1 Tempo. Characterized. I define tempo as the set of characteristic rhythms of decision-making in the subjective life of an individual or organization, colored by associated patterns of emotion and energy. Throughout this book, I will draw on everyday domains, such as the kitchen and the workplace, to illustrate concepts and principles. Occasionally, for variety, I will draw on other domains, including time-tested ones such as war and sports, and less familiar ones like music and traffic. Let us start with a few example domains. 1.11 Tempo in the kitchen. The kitchen is an excellent decision-making laboratory since it is a real-world domain, but small enough to be tractable. It is commonplace and familiar to most of us. It illustrates every important idea we will talk about, and works both as an example and as a metaphor for other domains. Our experience of the kitchen, unlike, say, our experience of politics or global warming, is relatively complete and self-contained. In the kitchen, we personally encounter everything from ideation through execution to consequences intended and unintended. Let's start by looking at an aspect of tempo in the kitchen. A sleepy restaurant in a small town is faced with an unexpected onslaught of diners from a tour bus while the executive chef is out running an errand. The staff starts to panic and lose its collective head. 10 minutes into the confusion, the executive chef returns and instantly gets that there is a situation. He barks orders. "You, get the water boiling for the pasta. You there, man the vegetable station and get started chopping the tomatoes. We're almost out of potatoes. You, run down to the store and get another 10 Pamels bag." This is an example of a pattern of tactical decision-making that we'll call scan to task. You look around and rapidly assign every open resource you see to an open problem. Gordon Ramsay, the celebrity chef, demonstrates this pattern very effectively on his television shows. There is a lot going on here. Several phenomena associated with decision-making, such as situation awareness, anticipatory planning, and resource management, are evident. But at the heart of the evolution of the situation is a change in the group's collective tempo at the 11th minute. when the executive chef turns confusion and anxiety into action. The psychological clock ticks faster, attempting to catch up with the real world. If you were to experience the episode and tell the story later, this would be a key moment in your narrative. This is not an accident. Shifts in tempo are central to the model of rationality I will develop in Chapter 4. Narrative Rationality 1.12. The Workplace. Work is a tougher domain to analyze than the kitchen. Much is hidden within the subtleties of language. Execution is a distant abstraction, often happening as far away as factories on the other side of the planet. Unintended consequences are hidden within the obscurity of international carbon credit trading schemes, rather than visibly accumulating in the kitchen trash can. But tempo changes are also central to the world of work, as we will see. Here is a simple example. A highly charged and stimulating business meeting is in progress. There is a sense of urgency. Agenda items are being raised, creative options are being quickly proposed, and decisions are being rapidly made. Quietly, at first, and then more forcefully, a hitherto silent participant interrupts to point out a tricky ethical issue that is being glibly ignored. Like dominoes falling, the participants shut up one by one and turn their attention to the interrupter. The symphony of effective deliberation and decision-making dies down, first to an uncertain murmur, and then to silence. Again, there is a lot going on. Assumed consensus, reframing, the interplay of values and decisions are all in evidence. Note that a change in tempo marks a critical turning point in the deliberations. The interruption and its aftermath will likely be remembered as the highlight of the meeting. 1.13 Personal Life. Let's round off this set of examples by moving over to personal life. Business books rarely pay much attention to this domain, but modern information workers, free agents, and virtual workers in particular, blend work and life in such intimate ways that it is impossible to manage the tempo of either in isolation. Our example is the sort of cliched episode that might appear in a romance novel. An experienced Casanova is on a date with an equally sophisticated woman. Artfully, he manages the pace of the evening, plying his companion with wine. His conversation is masterful. He maneuvers from comforting, relaxing topics to piquant ones. Our Casanova acknowledges the theatricality of the evening with gentle, ironic humor, but he is careful not to let irony overwhelm suspension of disbelief. At exactly the right moment, he sweeps her to the dance floor. The evening winds down, and they walk out of the restaurant, laughing, his arm around her waist, to the parking lot. A moment of silence follows as the laughter trails off and they approach the car. It is just slightly uncomfortable and physically awkward as he must let go of her waist to open the door for her. That's the opportunity he's been trying to casually engineer through the evening. With a hint of disarming fumbling, he leans in for a kiss, just stopping short to let her make the decision. Cliched though it is, though you've probably met men and women who can actually dance this dance, the hypothetical vignette is illuminating. The entire episode is characterized by the control, and letting go of control, of tempo and momentum, across a broad spectrum from relaxed to urgent. While the man nominally leads, the narrative of the evening is being co-created and managed by both the man and the woman. Through her deceptively lower energy, reactive role, the woman exercises as much control over the proceedings as the man does through his more active role. Overt decision-making is almost absent. The only meaningful fork-in-the-road moment is the kiss decision at the end, but the rest of evening has been so expertly managed, the outcome is irrelevant. The narrative can end gracefully, whatever the woman chooses to do. This represents a pinnacle of artistry where your mind is in what I like to call the clockless clock state. Keep this phrase in mind because we will glimpse more of the clockless clock in domains such as stand-up comedy and improvisational theater. Ultimately, all the concepts, theories, ideas, exercises, and examples in the book are merely scaffolding. This state is what we really want to explore. 1.2. Skill. Tempo doodling. In every chapter of this book, we will discuss a variety of behaviors, skilled and unskilled. Each chapter will explain one key behavior at a level of detail that will allow you to actually practice and acquire it. Many of these skills are based on fairly sophisticated ideas and require learning some concepts first. But the one you've just encountered can be understood and practiced without much theory. Detecting changes in tempo in your environment and becoming sensitive to how they affect your own emotions and energy. Wherever you are right now, be it at your desk, on a couch watching TV while reading, on an airplane, or in a cafe, see if you can detect the next change in tempo. Some of these can be subtle, like your refrigerator compressor turning itself on, or the switch from a subdued moment in your favorite sitcom to an excited commercial. Was there some restless shifting on the plane when the flight attendants brought out the beverage cart? Did that listless gang of young men at the table next to you in the cafe perk up when the pretty young woman walked in? You just observed tempo in the raw, along with all sorts of other distracting features. To develop a skill, you must first isolate it, just as you use dumbbells to isolate and work specific muscles. Here are your dumbbells for tempo detection. A doodle alphabet inspired by the fascinating art of Amy Lynn, whose colored pencil pieces are composed entirely of dots. In our tempo alphabet, empty circles are positive emotion events. Shaded circles are negative emotion events. Bigger is more energetic. Closer together is faster. To practice this skill, doodle in cafes and meetings. Here is an example phrase. And here is a sketch of an actual situation, such as one person talking to another, and steadily getting angrier. You might scribble something like this while watching an irate customer at a customer service desk, with one symbol per conversational turn. Can you tell which dots represent the customer? Don't worry about being precise. If the only way you can represent growing excitement is to have symbols overlap, let that happen. Try something more subtle, like a boring conversation that starts politely, but eventually becomes tired and slow-paced. As you play your private game of watching tempo changes in your favorite environments, pay attention to how your own emotions and energy levels respond. If you are up to watching two things at once, try capturing the tempo inside your head as well. Come up with your own doodle alphabet, or use colored pens if you like. Aim for art, not precision, and save particularly cool doodles. You can give them evocative names like Angry Dad Yelling at His Daughter. Ultimately, this exercise is just a warm-up. Beyond a point, you will not need to doodle. You can respond with your body. One exercise I find useful is to hold on to different levels of tension in your body, from complete relaxation to spikes of frozen alertness. By consciously holding on to your bodily reactions to environmental tempo changes for a little longer than they would normally last, you can train yourself to be more aware of them. This turns your entire body into a tempo barometer. As you try such exercises, you will find that becoming aware of internal and external tempos calms you, thereby muting your reactions. An instrument that systematically underreacts is no good, so you can try a more challenging exercise, deliberately overreacting to tempo changes. Practice being jumpy and on edge for 10 minutes, just to experience the feeling. It can be quite enlightening. To improve your skills, it helps to occasionally look through more sensitive eyes. That means consuming art, rent and watch. Walter Ruttmann's 1923 classic black-and-white movie, Berlin, the Symphony of a Great City, Berlin, Die Symphonie der Großstadt. To reinforce this skill, I will make more art suggestions throughout the book. Learning tempo awareness is easy. The next behavior will require more work. 1.3. A note on military thought. A note is in order to readers familiar with the historical development of military thought. Those who lack this familiarity can safely skip this section. Many of the ideas in this book were inspired by my work at Cornell, sponsored by the U.S. Air Force between 2004 and 2006. These range from the use of tempo as an overarching organizing concept to specific ideas such as my definition of situation awareness, which is directly borrowed from the military literature. At a broader level, the classic ideas of Clausewitz, Mahans, and Boyd 7 have been instrumental in shaping the decision-making models in this book, and this influence will be evident to knowledgeable readers. Besides this formal influence, many of the informal ideas and anecdotes that shaped my thinking originated in conversations with military veterans. Despite this influence, I have chosen to develop the material primarily using everyday civilian examples, for 3 reasons. The first is that I want to keep the book accessible to those without specialized knowledge of military matters. As I discovered through feedback on an early draft, even the simplest ideas from domains like air combat tend to confuse and distract the general reader. The second reason is that I prefer to tread with caution in a domain where I myself am at best an enthusiastic amateur, working with somewhat obsolete information. Too little time has passed for the lessons of early 21st century military conflicts to be codified into revised doctrines, but it is already clear that revisions will in fact be needed. It seems unwise to rely too heavily on material in obvious need of significant updates. And finally, I wish to avoid diving too deeply into the specific characteristics of adversarial situations, which are the primary concern of military thought. While there is an adversarial element in most socially situated decision-making, usually that element does not require much special handling. That said, this book originated in conversations with thoughtful, creative, and reflective members of the military, and I look forward to learning from any further such conversations it might spark. A friend, a Navy veteran, introduced me to this phrase while describing the leadership style of one of his COs. Readers familiar with the elements of Zen will no doubt recognize a kinship with the duality-busting, self-destructing nature of its concepts. This phrase was inspired by the collection of Zen koans, The Gateless Gate. Badpisamilinart.com, Chapter 2. 2.1. Emotion and Timing. Emotion results when you force yourself, or some part of the environment, to operate at a faster or slower tempo than it likes. To change a tempo, you must add or remove energy by applying a force. The image to keep in mind is a child on a swing, the simple sort comprising a tire hanging on a rope from a tree branch. Depending on when you push and in which direction, you can make the swing go higher, dampen it, change its direction, or change its phase. By holding the rope at different points, you can increase or decrease the frequency of the swing. The child will react to all this with delight, disappointment, relief, or frustration, depending on his mood. Dealing with any rhythmic process, such as a regularly scheduled meeting or a daily work-life routine, involves similar dynamics. Drive up the tempo too much, and calm yields to excitement, and then to anxiety and panic, which is why driving up tempo is a big part of creating FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, in adversarial situations. Shock and awe is an extreme example. Add too much damping, and emotions swing the other way. Calm yields to impatience, frustration, anger, and finally, depressed acceptance. Our reaction to trauma or the death of a loved one, the ultimate example of a living tempo being reduced to a dead stop, goes through an exaggerated version of this reaction, the Kubler-Ross stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The emotion of a tempo can even change with no change in pace and no new external factors. Humans and organizations naturally crave variety and stimulation. Stay too long at one tempo, and boredom will set in. The interplay of time and emotion is deeper than you might think. Subjective time might well be the more fundamental sort of time. Einstein's well-known quote was not a throwaway remark. When a man sits with a pretty girl for an hour, it seems like a minute. But let him sit on a hot stove for a minute and it's longer than any hour. That's relativity. Steve Mirsky notes in Scientific American, amazingly, the pretty girl hot stove quote is actually the abstract from a short paper written by Einstein that appeared in the now defunct Journal of Exothermic Science and Technology, Gest, Vol. 1, No. 9, 1938. Apparently, the great theoretician tried his hand, and other body parts, at experimentation to derive his simple explanation for relativity. While it is not clear whether the relativity of time as understood in physics has anything to do with the psychological relativity of time, the latter has been studied and measured since the 1930s, and a great deal is now known about how we subjectively experience time, and in particular, how we systematically underestimate or overestimate durations depending on context and emotional state. 2.2. Situation awareness. Context switching is the process of exiting one situation and immersing yourself into another. Merging onto a highway is a small-scale example. Part of this process is what is known in the military as developing situation awareness, sometimes called situational awareness. The perception of environmental elements within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. Plus, appropriately generalized, with space replaced by virtual social environment, this definition applies to most kinds of modern information work. Situations are the background against which extended episodes of connected decision-making play out. As we'll see in the next chapter, situation awareness is a measure of the current quality and relevance of a more persistent part of your thinking called a mental model. While developing situation awareness through a context switch, you must usually bootstrap action while absorbing the current state of the situation. In fact, in many domains you can only develop situation awareness by acting, not by observing. In cricket, for instance, a new batsman must develop situation awareness, a process known as getting your eye in, by cautiously playing the first few balls he faces. If he intends to dominate the bowler, a batsman will often send a signal after getting his eye in by playing a confident and decisive shot. Context switching can be purely tactile and sensory. Watch dancers segueing onto a dance floor, or mostly subconscious, even in verbal domains. Watch a newcomer joining a conversation. There are also cases where it is a conscious and deliberate process of discovery and sense-making. Think of an auditor trying to make sense of a pile of financial documents. Situation awareness degrades if it is not actively maintained through immersion. So, context switches are an asymmetric form of information work. Preparing your mind for the to domain is uphill work. Letting go of the from domain is downhill work. At work, for instance, it is easier to acquire the habit of making notes and capturing action items after a meeting, when the situation awareness is still strong in your mind. It is much harder to acquire the complementary habit of preparing adequately for meetings, since it is difficult to acquire the necessary situation awareness before actually entering the venue and encountering faces and voices. This asymmetry is one reason that startup situation awareness rituals, such as agenda reviews and approval of minutes, are more common than exit rituals. Post-processing happens more naturally than pre-processing. This asymmetry is due to the momentum of mental models, which we will cover in the next chapter. What happens while you are developing situation awareness? Of course, you notice, or anticipate, and classify the what, when, who, and where of the situation, which allows you to quickly load the right mental model into awareness. But the main action centers around developing awareness of rhythms. The world moves faster than we can hope to keep up, and we adapt by separating change into a background of predictable rhythms and a foreground of unusual rhythms and non-rhythmic elements. Without this separation into foreground and background, the sheer cognitive load of keeping up with change, the process of truth maintenance, would overwhelm us. So, rather efficiently, we hold the compact belief that the sun rises and sets every day, and relegate that belief to the background, rather than precisely tracking the sun at all times. Developing situation awareness is primarily the process of getting attuned to the dynamics of the background. Anything left over and unexplained is the foreground, raw material for active engagement. Let's look at some backgrounds. 2.2.1 in the kitchen. Let's try a context switch. Imagine walking into your kitchen. Stand and ponder its rhythms silently for a moment. Over years, appliances come and go. Over months, sacks of rice, tubs of margarine, and bottles of dish detergent run out. Over weeks, bottles of orange juice and loaves of bread come and go. Over days, food rots, leftovers get used up, the trash can fills up, and the fridge gets restocked with fresh vegetables. You add your own rhythms every time you cook. The kitchen comes awake when you enter. Over hours, as you cook, dishes move slowly from cabinets to countertop to sink to dish rack, creating something of a moving wave of clutter. At the fastest end of the spectrum, knives drum out breathless rhythms on cutting boards, and soups boil and bubble their way to crescendos. Embedded in this harmony, there might be the occasional moment of pure timing artistry, such as a pancake flip. If you are too hasty, it will stick and you'll make a mess. Wait too long and it will dry out or burn. You, as cook, eater, and yo-yo dieter, change too. Over a lifetime, you acquire and cultivate skills. Sometimes you neglect and lose skills. Over years, you acquire and lose habits and learn and forget recipes. Over months, you adapt your eating to your changing exercise and work routines, experiment with different cuisines, and switch cereals. As you age and your health changes, you build in systems to deal with issues such as high cholesterol or diabetes. Over weeks, you go grocery shopping and take out the garbage. Day after day, you ask yourself, "What shall I eat today?" Consider emotion. Does your sink spend most of its time cluttered with dirty dishes or clean and empty? Does trash promptly go out on time or regularly overflow and stink up the house?